Hi, everybody. My name is Michal Ogorzalek. I work in securing as an IT security consultant, where I mainly perform security tests of web applications. And last year, I had an opportunity to hack webinar platforms. Just for you to know, webinar platforms are slightly different from standard web conference platforms. In webinar platforms, typically the presenter speaks to the attendees, and webinar attendees do not interact with one another. The popularity of webinar platforms was already rising before the current pandemic. It is hard to give you accurate statistics now, but in 2020, the number of webinars grew 162%. Okay, so I was hacking webinar platforms, but not because I'm bad and I like breaking things. So let me share my screen and start with our story. Okay, everybody realized that the pandemic has changed the world. Most of our communication with the client, presentations, and training had to be transferred to the remote world. So our company started looking for a suitable platform which would enable us to provide knowledge to our clients. And one of our colleagues prepared for us webinar using third-party platform to test its possibilities. He was the host and the presenter. We were attendees. He was talking, sharing his screen, showing us the whiteboard. And after 5 minutes of the webinar, strange things started to happen. Firstly, somebody wrote indecent word on the whiteboard. Then my colleague, who was the host and the presenter, was kicked out of the meeting. And instead of him, another of my colleague became a host. I've already knew what had happened. We are pen testers. We are hackers for hire. And during the webinar, my colleagues started hacking the webinar, and one of them managed to find and exploit vulnerabilities in just a few minutes. Since the platform was not secure enough, we decided to find another one. However, the problem happened again. The second platform also had crucial vulnerabilities, and those company owners asked me and my colleague, Jakub Korepta, to press the hack button and verify the security of other platforms to get a view of how safe available solutions are. Before we began, we had defined assumptions of our research. We've selected the most popular webinar platforms based on the Majestic Million and spent about an hour per platform. We are hacking real applications, right? So to not break the law, we are testing from only one account on a platform, and only data related to the test account was accessed. A lot of things can go wrong in the context of webinar security. However, our main goal was to gain the host or presenter privileges as an anonymous attacker or an attendee of a meeting. Before I start, let me explain you how webinar platforms work. Generally, webinar platforms are web applications, and they use HTTP protocol for communication between client and server. A browser sends an HTTP request to the server and gets an HTTP response. Based on this response, a user interface of the application in a browser is created. But it is not enough when operations are to be performed in real time. To keep every webinar participant up to date with the meeting data, the messages being sent, the user being kicked out, etc., another protocol is used, namely WebSocket. For you to remember is that the WebSocket protocol is bidirectional. And while using it, we create the connection between a client browser, and a server. And messages can be sent in both directions. For example, if a host sends a message or mute a participant, WebSocket protocol is used to inform all participants about the change. During our test, we encountered a whole range of vulnerabilities, but we focused mainly on three aspects: privilege escalation, either by role modification or access control, and sensitive information in the browser, sensitive data of attendees or private conversations, etc. Okay, let's start hacking. How hard is to become a host? I see this button, I click this button, and I join a webinar. Then I intercept messages between my browser and the application server. Analyzing messages, I see that there is a very interesting parameter in the communication: the role. What do you think? What I can do with this parameter? I can change the value of the parameter to host or to presenter. Okay, we can do this. Then we need to wait a few seconds till resources are loaded, and I'm a host. That's all. That's all. The user interface is generated for the host. I can perform all operations, share my screen, and even kick out former host out of the meeting. Generally, I am the owner of the meeting. All I had to do was modify the value of one parameter related to the role of a user. Easy. We've tested 14 platforms overall, and in 2 of them, it was possible to become a host of a webinar in such a trivial way. But what about the rest? Even if the application does not allow users to modify their roles, it still can have access control issues. As we can see, some of functions are available only for administrators or hosts or presenters. For example, making another user a presenter. As an attendee, I cannot use this function. However, by using WebSocket connection that I have between my browser and the server, I can send this prepared WebSocket message and add new presenter. Okay, I sent this message, and now I am a presenter. Okay, so I added myself as a presenter, and what now? I can send another WebSocket message and execute other function to kick through host out of the webinar. Okay, I sent this message, and voila, the host is kicked out of the meeting. I couldn't modify the role just like before. However, result is exactly the same. The host is kicked out of the meeting, and I have full control over the webinar. All I did was send 2 WebSocket messages. That's all. And it all resulted from a complete lack of access control. Server hasn't verified the privileges, and I was able to execute administration functions. During our test, we've noticed a very interesting thing. In most cases, access control in HTTP communication was done properly. However, not in WebSocket messages. If we found some application vulnerable, the problem was global. There was no access control in any function that used WebSocket. Not counting the application that we've hacked by role modification, 3 other applications had access control issues, which allowed us to escalate privileges. Third common vulnerability that we found was sensitive information in the browser. For example, a webinar administrator or host has access to personal data of attendees, like email, like full name, like date of birth. almost everything that was supplied during registration. Attendees can see only nicknames. However, the data is sent to the browser of every attendee. The client-side application decides whether the data, like for example, full name, email, the date of birth, should be displayed or not. So, if attendees analyze the traffic that comes to their browser, they will access this data. Similar when sending private messaging during the webinar. User 2 is not able to see in the browser messages that are sent to user 1. However, the message is sent to every single attendee. And once again, client side, it is decided if the data should be displayed or no. So by analyzing the traffic that comes to the browsers, users are able to read private messages. Guess how many platforms had vulnerabilities related to sensitive information exposure? Half of them. We also found other vulnerabilities which allowed for example, spoofing messages or bypassing client-side validation. Other things can go wrong in context of the webinar security, but we cannot cover it all during our short presentation. So let's sum up our findings. We've tested 14 platforms overall, and in 5 of them we were able to escalate our privileges. Half of tested platforms had vulnerabilities related to sensitive exposure. The next step was to convey details of vulnerabilities to appropriate people responsible for security of these solutions. As it turned out, it was harder than finding bugs. Since there was no security dedicated contact on any website, our first shot was technical support. Obviously, details of vulnerabilities could not be passed to a random person, right? So we pushed for giving us a contact to a person responsible for the security. It looked like that. So we would like to inform that there is a serious vulnerability in the application. An attendee can become a host without privileges. Could you give us a contact to person responsible for security? And they respond with something like, this is the security issue. We are able to bypass your security mechanism. Maybe in other words, this is dangerous for user of your application. Could you give us a contact to security? There is no contact information here. Maybe you can escalate the problem and contact me with some technical people. Don't try to talk with support about technical stuff. It's completely useless. Sometimes we weren't getting any response, and when we got, it was the same story over and over again. Non-technical people were not able to understand the problem, and there was no process to handle the vulnerability reporting. Because of that, we started looking for a person responsible for the security, or at least a competent person in LinkedIn. It was definitely a better solution. And in the end, we've managed to report vulnerabilities to 4 companies. 2 of them fixed vulnerabilities in a week. A third one fixed them partially in a month. The last one has not fixed vulnerability yet. Okay, that's it. I hope that our research showed that sometimes it is enough for security specialists like me or like Jakub to spend an hour to find critical vulnerabilities. And I would like you to remember that similarly to other SaaS application, webinar platforms also have vulnerabilities. Security tests should involve all applications, including those provided by external vendors. And vulnerabilities happen in applications. From my point of view, very important is how these vulnerabilities are handled, if they are handled, how much a company cares about security. The problems that I talked about today are not limited just to webinar platforms. They concern also many other web applications. For example, a chat, for example, help desk or online trading. Generally, all web applications which use WebSocket for instant two-way communication with the browser. Most of vulnerabilities that we found were caused by lack of access control. And like I said earlier, during our test, many applications had access control implemented properly for HTTP communication, but not for web sockets. So if you have similar application, remember to implement access control also for web sockets. Do not send excessive data to users. If users are privileged to see only names, send them only names. Verify server side. If a user has privileges to access data or to perform an operation, do not rely on client-side validation. It can be easily bypassed. Perform tests and do threat modeling to detect vulnerabilities in your applications, and train your developers to prevent vulnerabilities. If they understand them and know how to write secure code, it is less likely that they will create code with vulnerabilities. Okay, that's it. I hope that you enjoyed our story. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And remember, if something is popular and publicly available, it is not necessarily well tested and secure. Thank you very much.